No, I just...
There we are.
Marvellous.
This is it.
I'm just going to go down.
So I just heard you say something.
Oh, test one, test two. All clear. We're standing there.
I did hear you
and
say
test the mic.
something. There's a bit of a delay.
Want me to stand there and test the mics? Before we get some- She's getting herself a little bit.
I can already hear it
right.
from here. The microphone's very sensitive.
Okay. Hi, Mum.
Coming through the last room. So, hi, Mum. Go on.
Hi, Mum.
It's a glass of water. It's waiting for you under the mic.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Good to have you with us tonight. Cold and wet and windy, even though it is. And I'll begin by recognising that we are located on Ghana land. They have been custodians of this place for thousands and thousands of years, and we say thank you. They have a special bond with the land and have a land culture which is fascinating, and the sense of the creative spirit in this land has absolutely amazed me and made me rethink a lot of things. So we say especially thank you to the Ghana people, and also endorse the efforts to see whether the Uluru Statement from the heart can be endorsed and become part of the Constitution. Tonight we have, well, Reverend Mike Pietsch. He's still a Lutheran, even though all sorts of things have happened. And I once wrote a little book, Why on Earth He's Still a Lutheran. But anyway, he's still a Lutheran and he hasn't been accused of heresy. And he's served in parishes in Melbourne and in Adelaide and even in Canada, you know. There's some very right-wing Lutherans in Canada. And in full-time chaplain in various places, high schools. For 19 years he was university chaplain here in South Australia. And I've heard about him in various rumours of various kinds. Recently he retired and now he focuses on his family, but well, he continues now to start and try and activate again, renew the role of a chaplain at the university here in South Australia. So, and he's an expert, well, a specialised interest in Bonhoeffer, and I think Bonhoeffer has something to say to those of us who are progressive Christians here today. Welcome, Mike Pietsch, please.
Thanks very much, Norm, and thank you all for coming out tonight to share this discussion. And I hope that it will be very much a discussion. I've got maybe a 35-minute, 40-minute presentation, and then we'll have hopefully lots of questions that come out of that then too. I've actually got a copy of all that I'm going to say, and even more, which I'll hand out at the end of the session today. So you don't need to necessarily take notes unless you've got lots of questions, which I'd happy that you write down and think about in the meantime. The relevance of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's religionless Christianity. It needs to be made clear from the start that religionless Christianity is not godless Christianity, but rather opens us up to a very different understanding of God than what we humans usually imagine or create or want God to be. It's not easy to describe Bonhoeffer's religionless Christianity, as he never really formulated it clearly, but he gave us a good springboard in that direction, though through the parts of an emerging book that he was putting together in the latter days of his imprisonment. So I hope to at least provide a starting point from which we can discuss Bonhoeffer's insights to shape the relevance of religionless Christianity for us in the 21st century. Bonhoeffer springboards us into the discussion out of the melting pot of the Nazi period, when he sloughed off the slag and the swirling molten from the swirling molten ores, and left us a thin layer of gold and silver at the bottom of the cauldron. Many scholars and commentators have managed to scrape off some of his insights in his completed works and his partially completed and fragmentary documents. Most of his documents are clear and precise and were clarion calls in the dark days of the Nazi era up until the late 1930s. Often they were seen as far too extreme and naive by other theologians and pastors who were looking for compromising responses to the powerful raw force of Nazi ideology in Germany. We know how far compromise with the Nazi regime got the church, both the state church and also the confessing church. However, Bonhoeffer's later works, such as his almost finished Ethics and his letters and papers from prison, have left us some very good homework and challenges. Bonhoeffer continues to enlighten us still today, challenging us and pointing us to the man for others, Jesus Christ. It bears noting that there is only one ongoing international conference that meets every 4 years that is focused around one theologian 80 years after they have died. The 14th International Dietrich Bonhoeffer Conference is to be held in January 2024 in Sydney with the theme Crisis and Hope, reading Bonhoeffer for today. This international group of people certainly does not have a naive focus on Bonhoeffer as a cult figure. It is an international group of scholarly and challenging theologians, historians, social scientists, and other interested people who continue to find even more facets to Bonhoeffer's responses to not only Nazism, but the paradigm shifts occurring in theological, philosophical, and ethical spheres in Europe and the world today. All of Bonhoeffer's brief yet incisive words about religionless Christianity are recorded in the later letters that he wrote to his friend and fellow pastor, Eberhard Bethger, during the last 2 years of his life, most of which was spent in Tegel Prison, Berlin, before being transferred to several other prisons and finally concentration camps. As always with Bonhoeffer, he interprets or sees the world through a paradoxical lens, using a dialectic that needs to always be held in tension. Often what are, or seem to be, polar opposites are only appreciated to their full when neither one is given prominence. The benefit of it is threefold: the two contrasting perspectives and the tension that holds them together. Bonhoeffer has often been misunderstood or misinterpreted when only one side of the paradox is presented. This is also seen in his writing about religionless Christianity. The following quotes will show his contrasting strong points being made and also the tension that exists between them. After a year in prison, Bonhoeffer wrote on the 30th of April 1944, "My fear and distrust of religiosity have become greater than ever here. You would be surprised, and perhaps even worried, by my theological thoughts and the conclusions they lead to. The time when people could be told everything by means of words, whether theological or pious, is over. And so is the time of inwardness and conscience. And that means the time of religion in general. We are moving towards a completely religionless time. People as they are now simply cannot be religious anymore. Our whole 1900-year-old Christian preaching and theology rests on the religious a priori of mankind. Christianity has always been a form, perhaps the true form of religion. But if one day it becomes clear that this a priori does not exist at all, but was a historically conditioned and transient form of human self-expression, and if therefore humans become radically religionless, and I think that is already more or less the case, what does that mean for Christianity? It means that the foundation is taken away from the whole of what has up to now been our Christianity, and that there remains only just a few last survivors of the age of chivalry, or a few intellectually dishonest people on whom we can descend as religious. But then, dialectically, Bonhoeffer goes on to push us further as church, continuing in the same letter. If our final judgment must be that the Western form of Christianity too was only a preliminary stage to a complete absence of religion, what kind of situation emerges for us, for the church? How can Christ become the Lord of the religionless as well? Are there religionless Christians? If religion is only a garment of Christianity, and even this garment has looked very different at times, then what is a religionless Christianity? Karl Barth, who was the only one to have started along this line of thought, did not carry it to completion, but arrived at a positivism of revelation, which in the last analysis is essentially a restoration. For the religionless working person, or any other person, nothing decisive is gained here. The questions to be answered would surely be, what do a church, a community, a sermon, a liturgy, a Christian life mean in a religionless world? How do we speak of God without religion? That is, without the temporally conditioned presuppositions of metaphysics, inwardness, and so on. How do we speak? Or perhaps we cannot now even speak, as we used to, in a secular way about God. In what way are we religionless secular Christians? In what way are we called the ecclesia, those who are called forth, not regarding ourselves from a religious point of view especially favoured, but rather as belonging wholly to the world? In that case, Christ is no longer an object of religion, but something quite different. Really, the Lord of the world. But what does that mean? What is the place of worship and prayer in a religionless situation? Bonhoeffer then scathingly writes, religious people speak of God when human knowledge has come to an end, perhaps simply because they are too lazy to think, or when human resources fail. In fact, it is always the deus ex machina, or the magician, that they bring onto the scene, either for the apparent solution of insoluble problems, or as strength in human failure. Always, that is to say, exploiting human weakness or human boundaries. I've come to be doubtful of talking about any human boundaries. Is even death, which people hardly fear now, and is sin, which they now hardly understand, still a genuine boundary today? It always seems to me that we are trying anxiously in this way to reserve some space for God. I should like to speak of God not on the boundaries, but at the centre. Not in weaknesses, but in strength. And therefore not in death and guilt, but in a person's life and goodness. As to the boundaries, it seems to me better to be silent and leave the insoluble unsolved. Belief in the resurrection is not the solution of the problem of death. God's beyond is not the beyond of our cognitive faculties. The transcendence of epistemological theory has nothing to do with the transcendence of God. God is beyond, in the midst of our life. The church stands not at the boundaries where human powers give out, but in the middle of the village. And then, pushing beyond Bultmann, Bonhoeffer writes a week later, on the 5th of May 44, that Bultmann's approach is fundamentally still a liberal one, that is, abridging the gospel. Whereas I'm trying to think theologically. What does it mean to interpret in a religious sense? I think it means to speak on the one hand metaphysically, and on the other hand individualistically. Neither of these is relevant to the biblical message, or to the person of today. Hasn't the individualistic question, with the emphasis on the individual, about personal salvation almost completely left us all. Aren't we really under the impression that there are more important things than that question? Perhaps not more important than the matter itself, but more important than the question. It is not with the beyond that we are concerned, but with this world as created and preserved, subject to laws, reconciled and restored. What is above this world is, in the gospel, intended to exist for this world. I mean, that not in the anthropocentric sense of liberal, mystic, pietistic, ethical theology, but in the biblical sense of creation and of incarnation, crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. In May 1944, Bonhoeffer wrote in a prison a personal and theological reflection for his godson's baptism, which included this paragraph. Our being Christians today will be limited to two things: prayer and righteous action. It is not for us to prophesy the day, or the day will come, when people will once more be called so to utter the word of God that the world will be changed and renewed by it. It will be a new language, perhaps quite non-religious, but liberating and redeeming, as was Jesus' language. It will shock people, and yet overcome them by its power. It will be the language of a new righteousness and truth, proclaiming God's peace with people and the coming of his kingdom. Some advanced words for his young godson. Bonhoeffer writes often of discovering God not in the boundaries of our world and universe, but right under our noses, in the centre of everyday life in the world. So on the 29th of May 1944 he writes, if in fact the frontiers of knowledge are being pushed further and further back, and that is bound to be the case, then God is being pushed back with those frontiers, and is therefore continually in retreat. We are to find God in what we know, not in what we don't know. God wants us to realise his presence, not in unsolved problems, but in those that are solved. That is true of the relationship between God and scientific knowledge, but it is also true of the wider human problems of death, suffering and guilt. It is now possible to find, even for these questions, human answers that take no account of whatever of God. In point of fact, people deal with these questions without God. It has always been so. And it is simply not true to say that only Christianity has the answers to them. As to the idea of solving problems, it may be that the Christian answers are just as unconvincing, or convincing, as any others. Here again, God is no stopgap. He must be recognised as the centre of life, not when we are at the end of our resources. It is his will to be recognised in life, and not only when death comes, in health and vigour, and not only in suffering, in our activities, and not only in our sin. The ground for this lies in the revelation of God in Jesus Christ. He is the centre of life, and he certainly didn't come to answer our unsolved problems. Bonhoeffer then locates the movement towards religionless Christianity in history. And on the 8th of June, he wrote, the movement that began about the 13th century towards the autonomy of humans, in which I should include the discovery of the laws by which the world lives and deals with itself in science, social and political matters, art, ethics and religion, has in our time reached an undoubted completion. Humanity has learned to deal with itself in all questions of importance without recourse to the working hypothesis called God. In questions of science, art and ethics, this has become an understood thing at which one now hardly dares to tilt. But for the last 100 years or so, it has also become increasingly true of religious questions. It is becoming evident that everything gets along without God, and in fact, just as well as before. As in the scientific field, so in human affairs generally, God is being pushed more and more out of life, losing more and more ground. Bonhoeffer then focuses in particular on the pastoral and theological matters by writing, efforts are made to prove to a world thus come of age that it cannot live without the tutelage of this God. Even though there has been surrender on all secular problems, there is still remained the so-called ultimate questions, death, guilt, to which only God can give an answer, and because of which we need God and the church and the pastor. So we live in some degree on these so-called ultimate questions of humanity. But what if one day they no longer exist as such? If they too can be answered without God? Bonhoeffer immediately accuses the church of wrongfully trying to use its last vestiges of professional power by trying to hobble the emerging human in the world come of age. He continues in this fashion. The attack by Christian apologetic on the adulthood of the world, he said, I consider to be, in the first place, pointless. In the second place, ignoble. And in the third place, unchristian. Pointless because it seems to me like an attempt to put a grown-up person back into adolescence. That is, to make them more dependent on things on which they are, in fact, no longer dependent, and thrusting them into problems that are, in fact, no longer problems to them. Ignoble, because it amounts to an attempt to exploit humanity's weakness for our purposes that are alien to them and to which they are have not freely assented. And unchristian, because it confused Christ with one particular stage in humanity's religiousness, that is, with a human law. The question is, Christ and the world that has come of age. The weakness of liberal theology was that it conceded to the world the right to determine Christ's place in the world. In the conflict between the church and the world, it accepted the comparatively easy terms of peace that the world dictated. Its strength was that it did not try to put the clock back, and that it genuinely accepted the battle. And Pietsch is an example of that. Even though this ended with its defeat. Defeat was followed by surrender and by an attempt to make a completely fresh start based on the fundamentals of the Bible and Reformation. But Bonhoeffer is not satisfied with any of the attempts at that stage, in 1944, to address the questions of religionlessness, Christianity, and the world come of age. Then he goes through a number of different areas, such as responses such as the Pietist and Methodist suggestions of Heim, Althaus, Tillich, but, he said, made some headway, but in the non-religious interpretation of theological concepts, he gave no concrete guidance. The confessing church has lapsed from positivism into conservative restoration. He cites people such as Schutz or the Oxford Group or the Binoculars. They're dangerous reactionaries. Bultmann seems to somehow have felt Barth's limitations, but he misconstrues them in the sense of liberal theology and so goes off into the typical liberal process of reduction. The mythological elements of Christianity are dropped and Christianity is reduced to its essence. This is where it's interesting to hear what he says. My view is that the full content, including the mythological concepts, must be kept. The New Testament is not a mythological clothing of a universal truth. This mythology, resurrection, etc., is the thing itself. But the concepts must be interpreted in such a way as not to make religion a precondition of faith. Only in that way, I think, will liberal theology be overcome, and at the same time its questions be genuinely taken up and answered. Thus, the world's coming of age is no longer an occasion for polemics and apologetics, but is now really better understood than it understands itself, namely on the basis of the gospel and in the light of Christ. The difference between the Christian hope of resurrection and the mythological hope is that the former sends a person back into their life on earth in a wholly new way, which is even more sharply defined than it is in the Old Testament. This world must not be prematurely written off. In this, the Old and the New Testaments are at one. Redemption myths arise from human boundary experiences, but Christ takes hold of a person at the centre of their life in this world. And then Bonhoeffer, at the end of this thinking and sifting on July the 16th, suggests finding the way forward in this dialectical and paradoxical manner. God would have us know that we must live as people who manage our lives without him. The God who is with us is the God who forsakes us. And we listen to this. The God who lets us live in the world without the working hypothesis of God is the God before whom we stand continually. Before God and with God, we live without God. God lets himself be pushed out of the world onto the cross. He is weak and powerless in the world. And that is precisely the way, the only way, in which he is with us and helps us. Matthew 8:17 makes it quite clear that Christ helps us, not by virtue of his omnipotence, but by virtue of his weakness and suffering. Here is the decisive difference between Christianity and all religions. Humans' religiosity makes them look in their distress to the power of God in the world. God is the Deus ex machina. The Bible directs people to God's powerlessness and suffering. Only the suffering God can help. To that extent, we may say that development towards the world's coming of age outlined above, which has done away with the false conception of God, opens up a way of seeing the God of the Bible, who wins power and space in the world by his weakness. This will probably be the starting point for our secular interpretation. And then in a letter dated July 18, 1944, Bonhoeffer refers to his poem Christians and Pagans as a way of understanding religionless Christianity. I won't actually read it now, but there'll be a copy of it in the... I know, it's an amazing poem, isn't it? In the same letter, he continues to tease out the question, and then he writes, "To be a Christian does not mean to be religious in a particular way, to make something of oneself, a sinner, a penitent, or a saint, on the basis of some method or other, but to be a person. Not a type of person, but the person that Christ creates in us. It is not the religious act that makes the Christian, but participation in the sufferings of God in the secular life. That is metanoia, or repentance. Not in the first place thinking about one's own needs, problems, sins and fears, but allowing oneself to be caught up into the way of Jesus Christ, into the messianic event, thus fulfilling Isaiah 53, which speaks about the suffering servant. The religious act is always something partial. Faith is something whole, involving the whole of one's life. Jesus calls people not to a new religion, but to life. But what does this life look like? This participation in the powerlessness of God in the world. I will write about that next time, he says in this letter to Edgar, I hope. Just one more point for today. When we speak of God in a non-religious way, we must speak of him in such a way that godlessness of the world is not in some way concealed, but rather revealed, and thus exposed to an unexpected light. The world that has come of age is more godless, and perhaps for that very reason nearer to God than the world before its coming of age, when it was clouded in religiosity and religiousness. July 21, 1944, he wrote, "During the last year or so I've come to know and understand more and more the profound this-worldliness of Christianity. The Christian is not a homo religiosus, but simply a person, just as Jesus was a person." I think Luther lived a this-worldly life in this sense, Bonhoeffer says. I discovered later that I'm still discovering right up to this moment that it is only by living completely in this world that one learns to have faith. One must completely abandon any attempt to make something of oneself, whether it be a saint or a converted sinner or a churchman or a so-called priestly type, a righteous person or an unrighteous one, a sick one or a healthy one. By this worldliness I mean living unreservedly in life's duties, problems, successes and failures, experiences and perplexities. In so doing, we throw ourselves completely into the arms of God, taking seriously not our own sufferings, but those of God in the world, watching with Christ in Gethsemane. That, I think, is faith. That is metanoia. And that is how one becomes a person and a Christian. How can success make us arrogant, or failure lead us astray, when we share in God's sufferings through a life of this kind? Speaking personally now, had a pastoral, academic and personal interest in Bonhoeffer for almost 40 years, but it has only been in the last 2 years that I've started to more fully explore his concept of religionless Christianity. This was inspired through meeting a fellow Australian, Peter Hooton, at the most recent Bonhoeffer conference in South Africa in 2020, just a week in before COVID. Peter had just written and published his PhD on Bonhoeffer's religionless Christianity in its Christological context. Copy here. I actually bought quite a few copies that we shared at the Bonhoeffer group last year, and there's an extra one here if anybody else wants to take one. Peter had been a career diplomat for the Australian government and has since become a theologian working now for the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture in Canberra. In Hooton's thesis, he examines the different sociological concepts of religion in the US and Europe because they both treat religion differently. He also has a number of gems as he tries to express where Bonhoeffer was going. Following are some such gems, and they include Hooton's attempt to rewrite and reword 7 biblical concepts in contemporary ideas and language. These 7 concepts are as follows. Repentance is described as ultimate honesty. Promise as meaning. Revelation as otherness. Incarnation as mediation. Atonement as dying to self. And resurrection as living for others. I found that some of these had possibilities, while others I thought were somewhat patchy, but at least Peter attempted to flesh out what Bonhoeffer both struggled with and did not have the time for after the war, due obviously to his death. There now follows a number of insights that Hooton has been able to highlight and amplify in Bonhoeffer's religionless Christianity. He writes, religionless Christianity must not overreach itself with its truth claims, for its leitmotif is a mystery which brings us eventually to a place simply of silent affirmation. It depends on paradox for its formulations because that is how structures of thought are broken down and space is created for the mystery. However, Hooton goes on to warn that Bonhoeffer is highly critical of mysticism in itself. Mysticism for Bonhoeffer is a religious endeavour to achieve some form of unity, whether intellectual, voluntaristic or emotional, with God on one's own initiative and based on one's own divine potential. But the gulf in between God and human beings simply cannot be bridged in this way. Bonhoeffer believes mysticism, understood in his thoroughly anthropocentric religious sense, to be fundamentally incompatible with the gospel of Jesus Christ. This is because mysticism, along with liberal, pietistic and ethical theology, encourages anthropocentric and therefore false understanding of transcendence, which the Bible, with its profound sense of God's grace at work in creation and in the incarnation, crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ, does not know. Indeed, mysticism may be regarded as symptomatic of the phenomenon of Western godlessness, whose God is the new human being, and which, in what Bonhoeffer describes as every possible Christianity, nationalist, socialist, rationalist and mystical, turns against the living God of the Bible, against Christ. His concern about this supposed mystical union is bound up in his social ethic of I, thou, which is very much part of Buber. But for Bonhoeffer, the community side of faith is so important. And this is Hooton summarises this by saying, for Bonhoeffer there can be no final assimilation, no fusion of our supposedly divine nature with God. Human beings are never lost in God or in one another. They exist always in ethical responsibility, but they remain ultimately, primally, that which God willed and created individually. Hooton explains in more detail Bonhoeffer's affirmation of meditation, but not to the extent where it becomes effectively a closed circle soliloquy that leaves out the relationship with the man for others, namely Jesus Christ. Hooton describes what faith is for Bonhoeffer in these words going on. Bonhoeffer characteristically believes the life of faith rests ultimately on an external foundation, quite outside ourselves. This foundation is living, dying, and rising of the Lord Jesus Christ, without whom the world is enclosed in the eye. The life of faith means to be captivated by the gaze of Jesus Christ, to see him only. Faith is thus, as John de Grucci suggests, not a certainty we possess, but a certainty that possesses us, the mystery of grace that makes believing possible in the first place. The church remains the place where the mysteries of the Christian faith are sheltered from profanation. It is most certainly not, however, a place of escape. For as Pietsch says, in this church or in the hidden place, Christ takes everyone who really encounters him by the shoulder, turning them around to face their fellow human beings and the world. Worldliness and an arcane discipline together serve to balance and correct one another. Houghton concludes in the following way, addressing what religionless Christianity will look like in a pluralistic religious world. It's his last paragraph. Might this vision of Jesus Christ not also, perhaps, serve to facilitate a particular kind of interfaith encounter, one grounded in the explicit recognition of God's claim on us, as faithful and ethically responsible human beings, to be there only for others, irrespective of the otherwise largely incidental specifics of the person's identity. This human being for others is not, of course, to be found in Zionism or Muslim fundamentalism or Hindu nationalism or ethnocentric varieties of Buddhism, any more than it is to be discerned in militant expressions of Christianity. Indeed, the human being for others is most unlikely to be found in any expression of faith which has not subjected itself to something very like Bonhoeffer's critique of religion, the critique of metaphysics, inwardness, and privilege, because it is precisely that this clears the way for God, the way from above to below. Unless in Barth's phrase, religion is taken out of the way, the radical significance of God's self-emptying love for God's creation must remain hidden from us. The real encounter with God will always be an incontrovertible because faithful experience of otherness. No religious idea of God can truly escape the closed circle of the self. Unless and until we rid ourselves of the gods of our own devising and open our hearts to the presence of God in every human being, we will continue to inhabit a fallen, dead ich-Welt, just I'm focused on myself, of our choosing, and will not have the experience of transcendence, that sure sense of the beyond in the midst of life, which Bonhoeffer calls encounter with Jesus Christ. There are two other books which critique and interpret Bonhoeffer's religionless Christianity. There's a number of them. And one is by Jenkins in the 1950s, in the early 1960s, and a more recent book by Jeffrey Pugh in 2008. Jenkins makes a number of points. He says that the main thesis of his book will be that these two closely related ideas of the need for an internal critique of religion from the point of view of faith and the need to move beyond religion into faithful action in the midst of the present world are of the greatest importance in helping the Christian community in the Western world to recognise and define the most urgent tasks which confront it. Jenkins also defines his term by the following. Faith is a reality beyond religion, and there is a sense in which it is true that it is only when a person is found released from the burden of religion that he can find his true fulfilment and maturity in self-forgetting service of God in the round of daily life. In faith, they possess not merely inward peace and reassurance, but the ability to express Christ's reconciling grace in human relationships of every kind, and also in relation to the natural world about us. Jenkins goes then on to the point of explaining how religionlessness liberates the modern age and the coming of age, in the sense that they're no longer under the tutors nor under the control of the rulers of this world. They are called to freedom and responsibility. Jenkins emphasises the importance of the church stepping back and liberating the various secular structures of society in these words. The first is that in the highly developed societies, the influence of the church as one secular organisation upon another secular organisation should be indirect. Christian people should also be eager to enable the university, the school, the government department, the factory and the sports club to fulfill their own function under God. Geoffrey Pugh corroborates this in these words: what was new in this was that Bonhoeffer no longer saw this movement towards human autonomy in a purely negative light, but affirmed it. But Pugh, in his book Religionless Christianity, also calls the church to hold in check the world come of age, to affirm it, but also to ask questions of it. If the church is not part of the power broking, but focusing on those at the bottom of the pile, which is where we find the crucified Christ, then it has both credibility and responsibility to speak out and up for those being trodden on by the parts of the world come of age, who are knowingly or unknowingly creating this pain and suffering, or not sharing the wider community's resources in a fair and just manner. A religionless Christianity takes responsibility to confront the world with a challenging word, but to its own surprise, this is not the word of dominance or power, exemplified by the rule of the righteous. This vision of the life of God, rooted in God's suffering, creates an inherent instability in the world that is not built upon the ideologies of nation-states or other forces of religion like that drive so much of the world presently. It is the reality of the suffering God found in Christ, who is himself immersed continually in the world. He continues by saying the disciples' lives are not determined by the boundaries of nation, state, blood or soil. The community is not even formed from religious impulses that result in more separation and violence. This community is formed by God in Christ, who calls us to a new order of life in the world, an order that loves fiercely that which God creates, even the enemy. This willingness to love the enemy constitutes the greatest threat to the powers today, because they simply cannot control this manifestation of God's grace. And if we could just have that image up, which is a fairly basic and simple image. I'm not good at graphic stuff. Yeah. Piece of music. Part of preface and fugue. Life is living in the tension and harmony of the melody lines over the sonorous present bass line. So we've got the bass line there, which is being played by the pedal, and then we've got the various melodies that are being played above that. Okay? And this bass line, which often can't be heard necessarily, but is there and which is based on that, is like the ground of our being, or God, or the loving, sacrificial, crucified God who's below us, not above us, but below us. This is an example that Bonhoeffer has used, but other people have too. We have so much freedom above that baseline to be the liberated adults that God calls us to be, living in the world with its complexities, beauty, tension, jarring at times and resolution, crescendos and piano and forte and diminuendos. Baseline is the springboard for all above it, but it does not control how high or how many spins and turns and appoggiaturas are developed in the music above. So that's about as much as I've got to share at the moment. And I'd like you just for a couple of minutes, perhaps to turn to a person who's near you, either in pairs or if you want to go into threes, that's fine too. And just think about what's been shared, and also, but more in particular, what sort of questions you might like to address to this presentation.
Well, I've already written my question down.
Okay, well, just...
Okay.
Just informally speak amongst yourself.
What question do you want to ask?
My question?
You want to ask? Melody?
Where would a pastor be in a religionless Christian kind of world?
That's your question.
You don't have to necessarily bring the questions up, if you can just field them from the floor once you've got them.
Do we need one in religionless Christianity?
Where would a pastor be in a religionless Christianity kind of world? Where would
side of this. We're automatically all. And I am living that man. That's
What would the world be? What would there be need to do? Would there be no religion? There's no need to have the education. You would bring out education. To be able to see it out yourself, you would have to go to a pastor or a Christian leader or anyone else. There would be no need for it. Holds people back.
balls back.
I'm trying to be verbally aggressive. I'm trying my best.
That's good. The question you say, what if our religion? What is the religion?
From my perspective, the church is followed as people that dictate how Christianity is supposed to develop.
I say, okay. So get rid of all that authority.
Where would we?
Where would you go from
How
that?
would you mind?
Any truth of meaning?
Any, for example, a simple question for a question. And if you find those questions, you really return to get that. You obviously do need some form of religious structure for some
You know what's religion in the church? How do you know it? How do you know it? What do you do in the Bible?
yeah. That's my I hope you can handle that one.
All right.
I think if we could,
Okay.
you're welcome to make questions or just comments.
I hope you can handle that.
Oh,
I think we're going to go. Are we going around with the microphone or people?
you got a separate mic there, or will you use this one? You got a mic?
So, yes, if we've got questions, I'll bring you the microphone around and hold it nice and close to your mouth so you make a nice loud sound.
This is the people who aren't here and who are listening to this as a recording, all live. This one at the back.
Pointing it around looks scared.
Mike, what's the difference between religionless Christianity for Bonhoeffer and liberation theology, do you think?
Liberation theology. Well, obviously, Bonhoeffer was seminal in encouraging, well, not personally, but it became a factor in the life of the church. I don't think only from Bonhoeffer's perspective, but he certainly was very significant in what happened in South Africa. Hence the reason why we had the conference there in South Africa, the apartheid movement and the church there. I think what is the religionless Christianity frees us up and literally liberates us to think about the church in a totally different way, to think about the world and life in a different way. So liberation theology is one expression of that. There's not a. I think if it was alive, Bonhoeffer would have been excited that was one of the ways in which the church took it on board as to how it could be move away from the power structures, which liberation theology obviously was very much fighting against. And to say that this concept of looking at the power and authority above, which is often embodied by God as well as the state and the church and all that sort of thing, to say, no, we're looking at this from the people who have been oppressed and hurt and broken down the bottom. Does that sort of answer that? Yeah. I'm not sure otherwise.
So you see them as quite congruent.
In many ways they are. Yeah. I don't. I mean, there's not I don't know what the direct line is, or whether there is a direct line between the two. But I know that Bonhoeffer was certainly influential in that discussion, but as were many other people too. And there's, I mean, even the fact that you know, the book that I was quoting before, Jenkins. It's interesting. We did Honest to God last week, which was in the early 1960s, 62. But Jenkins had actually presented his paper back in, I think it was 57, in Canada, had a special presentation there. He polished it up and in about 61, so it just preceded Honest to God. But there was obviously a lot of thinking, naturally after the war, as to how we can be a better world. I mean, even the fact that the United Nations was created was an exciting moment for us as humanity, really. Yeah. And I think you know, things like liberation theology were very much a part of that then too. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Yeah.
Okay.
My question's focused on the religionless Christianity you mentioned. Religions would take the political bullocks from the church and the control from the church. But what if there are people that are curious and want to learn, but they have no leaders to go to? What is the world, a religionless Christianity-based world, without what's the future for the pastor or the Christian leader? Would there no need for none of these, or would this be? I would see many problems with that.
There are, in a sense, because it actually is topsy-turvy, because the religious leader, as Christ calls his disciples, is to be the ultimate servant, and not the one who a person goes to for all the answers, but a person who helps the person to discover who Jesus is and who Christ is and what he's saying.
Without the knowledge, how are you meant to serve?
No, I mean it doesn't mean that there won't be churches or that there won't be worship services, but they will be done and they are done now in many places in a different way, so that it's not done in a top-down manner, but it's even something as simple as in the past, often the pastor was the one who received communion first, and the people who were serving. Often now in churches, they are the ones who receive it last, as an example. I mean, that's a very simple way of an example within the actual church itself. So there will always be need for people who are passionate about Christ, who also might be either professional or not professional, paid or unpaid, who will want to share and talk about their faith. And there'll be some people who know less and some people who know more, but there'll also be the equal part where the people who know more about their faith might learn far more from the people who know less about it, as Bonhoeffer was saying. Maybe we in the religious institution can learn more from the non-religious people in the community as to what the gospel really is about.
A bit like my Discord.
Yeah, I mean, it's any place. I mean, whether it's online, we might be talking to people that are simply out in the community that's discussing questions about faith without saying, "Oh, you must come and see this particular professional person who's done X number of years of study." So it gets away. It breaks down that hierarchical expectation that we have, which doesn't dismiss that. And it's not just smashing it to pieces, but it's questioning it and saying, don't look necessarily up, but also look down at the person that you're helping in the parks, the parks, the CBD, at the soup kitchen, or wherever it might be. this help. Maybe you'll discover as much about Christ there as you will going to seminary in the Third Age or wherever.
Okay.
Thanks, Bruce.
I'm trying to get myself a definition of religionless Christianity, but what I thought might help me do that is to think of the opposite. What is religious Christianity? And religious Christianity seems to me to be Christianity with traditional, institutionalized ideas about God. So religionless Christianity might be a Christianity with a renewed kind of image of God.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of saying it, and I should have talked to you earlier today about that. In our Bonhoeffer group, where we did actually read the Hooten book last year, Peter over here came up with a definition of it. I came up with a definition of it, and somebody else did also. And I've been trying to work on a definition of it, but today I just said, no, this is too hard, or at least it's not. I don't think it's totally too hard, but this is a work in progress, and I didn't want to simply give you something that was less worked out than it should be. But I think that what you're saying, Esmond, is a fair thing. That we need to, and that's in some ways what Hooten was also saying when we're talking between other religions too. That together we can hear their understanding of God, but he's also saying we do this in a non-religious way, without sort of putting shackles or having this human image of what God is, or acknowledge that we've got human images of God, and ask, where do we really find God in the world? And obviously, in honesty, a Christian would go to that and say, well, for me, this is here. Where do you find God? So I think it is very much that openness and that humility, actually, which is the whole aspect of the Incarnation, that humility that Christ was on this earth for 30 years before he said anything publicly. And I'm sure he heard and thought and experienced an immense amount in that time before he even said a word. And that in itself is an act of humility and listening to people, and not listening to a lot of people's pain as well. But I think you're certainly on the right track, and I think if anybody else has got some definitions that way, that'd be good.
I was, in very similar vein, I was surprised how quickly in the 20th century that Christian socialism was abandoned. And I'm wondering if Bonhoeffer was trying to separate the institutional hierarchies from religion with his concept. And so he wanted to maintain those hierarchies, perhaps for the social control they provided. And specifically, I was wondering if he looked favourably on the German nobility, for example, and he saw honour there. And so he wasn't a Christian socialist, is that in that regard of removing social hierarchies. He was just keen to remove just the religious hierarchy. Is that a fair reasoning?
I'm just trying to think about all of that you're saying there. You're saying that he wouldn't have supported the social movements. Yeah. I think he would have asked questions why people are doing it, in terms of motives and all that sort of stuff, as well as of himself. But at the same time, he would obviously have said that this is part of our Christian duty to be doing that, because that's where Christ is. That's he would have supported the institutions in Germany where the Nazis were, killing people who had physical and mental handicaps and all that sort of stuff. which was very much a part of the structure of the church, both then and now in Germany. A fair bit is made of the fact that he came from an aristocratic background, which he did. But at the same time, in his documents, which he wrote in 1943, just before he went into prison, which was called After 10 Years, which is a devastating document. It basically says from 1933 to 1943, nothing has worked. And he says all of these different things, duty, not being a noble person, or being whatever, and at the end he says, we only have the view from below. And this is where we are, and this is what we're learning from. So I don't think he would have, he's not there in the sense of saying, I'm not bringing in, this isn't simply about bringing in a social cause. He's saying that social cause, to be perhaps more effective, is not there for simply the cause, but to be an expression of discovering where Christ is. And that would be all sorts of things. It might just simply be being the dad who's changing the nappies at 3 o'clock in the morning, at home. Or it might be the person who's helping someone in the park, in CBD, or it might be, the teacher who's spending extra time with that absolutely painful student that they don't like, but they know needs the help that they are there. So I think that's the aspect of this music, that what happens up the top is all sorts of stuff. And I think that's the freedom and the liberation that Christ gives to all of us and wants us to all have and embrace, and for us to affirm in each other, wherever and whatever Christ is saying to us in our lives as we engage with Him.
My introduction to Bonhoeffer was in reading Letters and Papers from Prison, which I read as a, 19-year-old, I guess. And having read that, which rang many bells for me at the time in my search, I was then recommended to go back and read an earlier book by Bonhoeffer, which was The Cost of Discipleship. And I read this and became quite nonplussed, because it seemed to me to be a very conventional evangelical commentary on the Sermon on the Mount. And in subsequent years I thought, how did the man who wrote that then write a very different book about, or a series of papers about religionless Christianity? And I guess my conclusion is that it was the fact of the National Socialists and Hitler and the terrible things that were going on in that decade you spoke of. And does that lead us to think that it's only in times when the blowtorch is really applied that the church makes any progress in defining where it's standing? Do we need more of a refiner's fire?
Well, that's a very interesting comment in itself. And they say that the church lives out of the blood of the martyrs, where things are really tough, that things have to get down to Q-tax, and people have to really say what is important in this context. I'm not sure whether how different, or to what extent his attitude in discipleship. I see, his discipleship is you go where Christ is. And he, where Christ has taken you, and in his case, Christ took him to be part of the out there, the intelligence within the German belly of the beast, and that in itself was hard enough. But that was for him simply the cost of his discipleship was to go there, which was actually out of the protection, if you like, or the support, at least, not the protection, but certainly the support of the confessing church, which actually looked back at him and questioned whether or not he'd simply gone to the other side. So that in itself for him was hard enough, let alone having to then live a double life, literally, as both for the Germans but against the Germans. I mean, even we just recently in the Bonhoeffer group looked at his supposed pacifism, you know, which he certainly was strongly influenced by an absolute pacifist in America, John Lasseter. But then he comes to be also part of the plot to kill Hitler, and so now at the moment in the Bonhoeffer group we're looking at ethics to say how can you come from here to there, and I think that's the freedom and the liberation that he was embraced by and embraced, to be able to say and go, this is the right thing at this moment. I don't know if that's somewhat helpful.
Any more urgent questions?
Maybe one more question, you think, Norm?
Yeah, one more question.
We've had a lot of influence on Bonhoeffer in Australia, but I was wondering if Australian theology and Australian ministers had any influence on Bonhoeffer. Was there any communication with, say, Salvation Army or the Methodists in outback Queensland who were perhaps had the flame on their genitals, and yeah.
Are you saying actual historical contact between? Yes. No, I mean the main historical contact that he had with the wider international church was basically within Europe itself, because he was very much a part of the formative World Council of Churches at the time. He was one of the young, within the youth part of that, because he was only in his 20s at that stage. And then he was, he had connections with England, and then also with America, of course. And he had wanted to go to India, but that was curtailed because they needed, the confessing church needed people to run the seminary, one of the 4 seminaries that they had. But I don't know of any, unless somebody else does, of any contact with Australia per se. Actually, even when I discovered that we're doing the conference here in Sydney, which there's quite a significant group on the East Coast who actually were having a Bonhoeffer conference each year pretty well for quite some time. And so it's fantastic that they've actually taken up the invitation to have it there. And I think, I'm not sure even how, I mean, I'm sure seminary-wise he's had influence here, post his death and everything else like that, obviously with his theological writings. But I don't think there was actually anything prior to that, no. Sadly. Before I, perhaps Norm says tonight, before I forget, I've left a copy of the paper.
Yeah.
And one other thing I have to say too, Norm, if you don't mind. At the bottom of the paper, I've got my website. I've just almost got a website up. Well, it is up, but it's not totally complete, but it's mostly complete. And on one of the sections in it, the 4 sections, is on Bonhoeffer in particular. One of the papers, for example, will have all of the Bonhoeffer quotes on religionless Christianity in it as well. That'll be one of them. But there are. I did my master's thesis on Bonhoeffer's Christology as a framework for university chaplaincy. And I've then also made that for prison chaplaincy, hospital chaplaincy, and government high school chaplaincy. And I've done that in conjunction with other people too, sort of partnered with them in that. So you're welcome to check the website out if you want to follow more. And that's just at the bottom of the paper, which you're very welcome to take. And if you want to, I think there's probably extra copies if you wanted to take any extra ones for anybody else that might be interested too.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, why don't we say special thanks for the show.
Speak into the microphone there.
And then you're welcome to come again next week. because yours truly will be doing a special presentation, which is up on the board there. 7 gods of the Bible, and you have to make a choice.
I choose
We
Yahweh.
get to vote.
Or if you don't want to make a choice, you can choose 3, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Yay.
But anyway, it's the exploration of the reality of 7 different portrayals of God, which are very different from each other. And if you want Yahweh, then you've got the colonial God. But anyway, I invite you to come next week and have a dialogue with the gods of the Bible, and I hope it will be exciting. And I think there's coffee and tea. Or
Yes, there is.
yes, coffee and tea, please. So stop, and you can have a chat with my fellow Lutheran here at any time you want to. Thank you.
And if anybody wants to borrow this, they're welcome. I've got mine as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Right in the front.
Good. Well done.
Well done.